Hi my lovelies, welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Before I get on with my next true crime video, I'm going to tell you some really exciting news, which is that I've been sponsored by Channel 4 to do this particular video, and it's awesome because I'm going to be talking about a new series that's out. I know every single one of you who joins me on my channel is as obsessed with crime as I am, which is why I'm so chuffed to be telling you about Murder Island. It's an incredible new 6-part show that started on Tuesday, October the 5th, so it's just been on, and if you haven't caught it, make sure you catch up with it. You're gonna absolutely love it. The premise of the show is to take a group of armchair detectives, like all of us, to a remote island where they basically need to work out who is responsible for a murder. It has been shot in an incredible place. It's on the remote Scottish island of Geisha, and it's based around a murder plot which has been written and developed by Ian Rankin himself. And if you don't know Ian, he is an unbelievable crime writer, known for his novels such as Black and Blue, Knots and Crosses, and In a House of Lies. His work's also been adapted for the small screen, so a massive history of incredible writing. So the way this series has began is that our amateur detective investigators arrived on the island. They've then been split into teams of 2 before they're being taken to the crime scene where Charlie Hendrick's body has been discovered at a rundown property that she rents. And it's going to be the job of the 8 players who are taking part to figure out who done it. I know you all want to be there. I want to be there as well. Now, what makes this series just incredible, really unique, is the experts that are involved. So they've drafted in top senior investigating officers, forensics, psychologists, all whose job it is to keep our teams on their toes. It's their job to call out their errors and also to step in, give their expertise and advice when required. They're also going to follow leads, interview actual suspects and compete against each other as they race to capture Cheryl Hendrick's murderer. Could this actually feel any more real if it tried to? And if that wasn't enough, there is a distinction between the real world and the world in Murder Island, because if you happen to find out who the murderer is and you win, you're going to be rewarded with a prize of £50,000. That's what's going to happen. One lucky team are going to be leaving that island considerably richer. Even better, you can test your own skills on Channel 4's Murder Island Hub that I'm going to link below. Go and admit it. This is right up your street. This is right up our street. So make sure that you tune in for the next 5 Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. on Channel 4 and go back and watch the first episode. And tell me if you, like me, think that you will be able to nail the murderer on the first and second episode and then regret that we're not in the running for a 50 grand prize. Let me know in the comments below, and when you've watched the first episode, if you're caught up or if you have watched it, and you can comment, let me know your thoughts so we can compare our notes. It's gonna be a ride. Hi my lovelies, welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. And if this is your first time finding my channel just because you've stumbled across it, then why don't you just subscribe? Because if you found it and you like crime and you also like a bit of consistency, then this is gonna be the channel for you. And also, if you're back here and you haven't subscribed, what are you doing? I require the subscription, please. Also, I love your comments and I love your likes. I really appreciate the interaction. Thanks to all my Patreon fans, you're amazing. Thank you for the support you're giving me. It means that I can do more and work harder and do more research, and I massively, massively have gratitude for you, as I do to every single one of you who joins me here. But let's get on with today's case. It's going to be one that I think is quite a struggle because I find every single murder case is challenging. Of course it is. It involves people who did not deserve to die. But when it involves somebody who may have had issues with their development, so somebody who, shall we say, in this case, has a mental age far younger than her years, I just think it speaks to our vulnerability levels and really sparks that protectiveness that so many of us feel towards individuals who aren't as fortunate as people who don't deal with those concerns and issues themselves. We're going to be covering the case of the murder of Jennifer Daugherty. She was murdered by 20-year-old Melvin Knight, 17-year-old Angela Lynn Marinucci, 23-year-old Ricky Smyrnes, 20-year-old Amber Meidinger, 27-year-old Peggy Miller, and 36-year-old Robert Masters. So, how did this crime occur? Well, before we arrive at that, we need to talk about Jennifer, who she was, and how on earth she ended up in such a vulnerable situation. So Jennifer Daugherty was born on the 8th of November 1979. She lived with a mother and a stepfather, that was Denise and Bobby Murphy, and they lived in Mount Pleasant, which is one of the oldest towns in southwestern Pennsylvania. And she was a really happy, kind and gentle kid. She was. Everybody who knew her growing up said that she was a lovely soul. She was an individual that you cannot imagine for a moment wishing to harm. There was a vulnerability about her. Her parents actually described her as fun, really easygoing, and one of the things that they noted about her nature was she was one of those individuals that people really warmed to. And because of that, she found it really easy to make friends. She was an individual that people just wanted to be around. She also had learning difficulties. So she was 30 years of age, but she had the mental capacity of a 12 to 14-year-old, which is considerable, isn't it? If you think about what we expect from a 30-year-old developmentally compared to what we would expect from a 12 to 14-year-old, there's clearly going to be a vulnerability, naivety and innocence around this particular individual's psyche. But one of the things that stood out about Jennifer was that from a really early age, she craved the ability to become independent. It was something that she wanted. So even though she had her special needs, she still saw her future as full of hope and possibility and living independently. And that's testament to her, really, isn't it? Parents really did understand that this was something that she wanted, and they also knew that because they brought her up so effectively and so well, and they trusted her, that she was able to look after her basic needs. But as most of us parents are, they were worried about her living by herself. And I completely get that. I have late teenagers, and the reality is that I can't imagine them ever leaving home. It is my plan that they never do. Don't tell them that. But it's really worrying, the idea that they're going into the world without you. You won't be able to check when they're in or when they get up in the morning. It's all these thoughts that go through your mind, and you're like, I will basically be a stalker for my children. I've actually subliminally processed mine to let me go with them and live in their outhouse wherever they go. That's where I'll be filming these videos in around 15 years. But they had those genuine concerns. And of course, when somebody has developmental issues, you are concerned because they are more vulnerable than the average person. One of the main reasons they had that concern is because of her naivety. She trusted people. And we see this, if any of you have ever heard of the case of Gemma Hayter, it's a case I've covered on television a few times. Again, she was an individual who had learning difficulties, and one of her biggest pitfalls and problems in life was she trusted anyone and everyone. If they were nice to her for a moment, she wanted to be their friend. And that does not set you in good stead when it comes to the potential of being harmed by other individuals, because predators can see those vulnerabilities very, very easily. Because of this, her parents did take care of things like her financial affairs. They also made sure that they got her benefit payments, so they kept her in order, so to speak. And that was very effective. It worked well. They allowed her independence to some degree, but they made sure that they were in charge of the important elements of her well-being. So, early February 2010, Jennifer had a conversation with her parents, and that conversation involved the fact that she wanted to go and stay in an apartment in Greensburg with somebody that she referred to called Peggy. The way that she introduced this relationship was that she'd met Peggy at a local community centre there. Her parents agreed. You know, she's 30 years of age. They encouraged her independence, they wanted her to foster new relationships, and they were probably very glad that she'd met a friend. She also made it clear that she would be turning up the following day after meeting Peggy to go to a doctor's appointment because she needed to collect her medication. So before she leaves, Jennifer actually leaves Peggy's contact details, and she also wrote a note to her mum, and it said, "Mom, I hope you have a good day at work, and I love you very much." It's just knowing what happens to Jennifer is heartbreaking. But again, just that insight that the last thing that she was thinking of when she walked out the door to go and see Peggy was how much she loved her mother. And I'm sure that to some degree, that last note is an incredibly painful thing to keep hold of, but it's also really representative and resonant of the incredible love that Jennifer had for her parents, and no doubt that her parents had for her. On the 8th of February 2010, Bobby, Jennifer's dad, drops Jennifer off at the bus station. So he puts her there safely, makes sure she gets there, and sees her off on her travels. But that's the last time that any of her family would see her alive. It's hard imagining what that's like for a parent, to drop your child off feeling that they are safe, that they are well, they're excited, they're hopeful, and you're feeling hope for them. And yet actually that was the last moment that you'd ever see them breathing. And that's something that will stay with that family, because they'll have all the what ifs and the buts. It's what we do as humans. If only I could have, if only we'd said no. And whilst they have absolutely no guilt to bear, I think it's very prevalent with families who lose people in such traumatic circumstances. It actually turns out that Jennifer had arranged to stay overnight with 23-year-old Ricky Smyrnes. That's an apartment that he shared with Peggy in Greensburg. Now, he'd been texting her, it seems, and the reason that he'd been texting her was he was encouraging her to stay over. However, when we look at Smyrnes, it turns out he had a relatively dark and troubling past. And remember, we're looking at Jennifer, very vulnerable, very naive, very innocent, developmentally delayed, and she's going to a home to spend the night with an individual who historically has got quite a lot of crime, and she won't be aware of this in his history. So significant history of felony convictions, and these included burglary and sexual assault. They are big charges, right? Burglary, okay, you know, people do make mistakes, particularly if they're struggling with money and so on and so forth. But sexual assault is a high-level offence. And this innocent, naive woman, albeit with the mentality of a young teen, is walking into this situation. Now, Smyrnes had a troubled childhood, I'll give him that. You know, when you look at his experience growing up, his mum was a drug-addicted Philadelphia sex worker, and his father was a Pittsburgh gang member. Not the best start in life. And I get it, there are lots of sex workers who are perfectly good parents, completely, absolutely accept that. But she was drug-riddled and his father was a gang member. Not exactly stability orientated, is it? So he did have a difficult start. Also, he was sexually abused as a child by his father and uncle. Won the lottery there, didn't he? In parents and parents' siblings. And it demonstrates the fact that he would have been highly traumatized as a child. Also, because of this, he ended up in and out of foster homes, which is always incredibly challenging for any child. And he started being treated for mental health disorders at 4 years of age. Now, I will be honest, that's amazing that the treatment actually happened, because in lots of places, and certainly in my experience of working within the social services system and the care system, mental health disorders are not necessarily recognised that early and are very rarely treated. So we can say that at least there were supportive foundations and mechanisms being put into place. Now, this abuse and neglect must have been horrific. And the fact that when he was 10 years of age, he'd actually had 103 therapy sessions at that point demonstrates that he was considered at high risk and probably was seen as having some potential problems in the long term, which we would expect with such horrible abandonment, attachment, abuse issues. They are really hardcore experiences for any child to deal with at any age. But nonetheless, the support was given to him, although it doesn't seem that it had that much of a positive impact. By the time he was 6, it's recorded that he'd tried beer, cocaine, heroin, and weed, marijuana. Yeah, you heard that. By age 6. And what does that mean? We all know what that means. It means adults who are meant to be in primary care of this child were providing them with drugs. No 6-year-old is going out scoring crack. It does not happen. They're being provided with the drugs. So horrible life, shitty parents, dreadful actions of adults around them, and also clear trauma dealt with by that child. At 8 years of age, unsurprisingly, he's actually diagnosed with PTSD. Does not surprise me in any way, shape or form. How could you not be horrifically traumatized? I would imagine it's actually CPTSD, because the abuse was systematic and consistent. Therefore, it would be more complex to deal with than normal PTSD, although both are very challenging. Also, it was recorded that he suffered from multiple personality disorder. We would know multiple personality disorder as dissociative disorder, but some people refer to it that way. Some people also used to refer to it as split personality syndrome. These are diagnoses that you might relate to if you'd watched something like the film Split, where there are all these alters living in one human being that are usually unaware of one another until there is therapy, and then they can become more aware of each other, although some people are aware of their alters. The problem there is that if somebody has this particular disorder, and let me tell you, it is a contentious one. Many people in psychiatry and psychology don't necessarily believe this condition exists. Listen to Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil, none of it's real. Dr. Phil does think he's Yoda. And he also thinks that he knows everything. I'm just saying, as a psychologist, you can't really verbatim say that something isn't real. But Dr. Phil has a go. I like Dr. Phil. I do watch him occasionally. I'm just saying, a little bit exploitative. Never mind. But that aside, Dr. Phil aside, multiple personality disorder we would recognise in the UK as dissociative disorder. Again, contentious, lots of people have different ideas about it. Personally, I believe absolutely that people can experience states where they are unaware and that personalities can come through there. And I think that when somebody is highly traumatised and there are points in a child's experience where they have no control and they have very little protective opportunity because they don't have the option to fight, they haven't got the physical strength to defend themselves, there is going to be a way that the brain manifests coping with that. Therefore, it would make sense to create other personalities that are present, which protect the conscious child and take them to a safe place whilst they essentially face and confront the abuse. So it makes perfect sense to me that that is a possibility, and it makes perfect sense to me that individuals experience these states, and I'm really not that concerned about what other professionals think, because for me, it's the individual's experience that we listen to. But nonetheless, he's diagnosed with that and also 14 other psychiatric issues. That is a lot of diagnosing. With respect, I'd also just usher in a bit of caution here, because I think when you get lots and lots and lots of diagnoses like this, it tends to be that certain professionals have seen you, then you've gone to another person, and they've all added another abundance of disorders, whereas sometimes it's almost like there needs to be a completely fresh look at an individual's mindset and mentality and kind of wipe away all of those diagnoses and just do an assessment when they get to a certain age and kind of work it through in that context without knowing anything about prior, because I think sometimes people do just get into this scenario where individuals see extra bits and pieces and additionalize an already very complex diagnosis. But you can see he was struggling, he had a really hard time, and he should never have gone through any of those things as a child. None of that will dissuade me from my judgment later on. But we can clearly see that he came from an entirely different world to Jennifer. Jennifer in this loved, cared for, compassionately parented environment where she was safe and she could trust, and she had a world where people genuinely cared for her. So she comes from a completely different universe, let alone world. But she really liked Smyrnes, and it feels like at the time she felt like they were actually in a relationship. However, it's complex because Smyrnes is also in a relationship with 17-year-old Angela Marinucci. So he's got more than one person on the go, so to speak. And remember, 17, so kind of a similar mental age to one another as far as Jennifer and Angela are concerned. And it tells you that Smyrnes is probably looking for people who are easy to control, who are more vulnerable, who are more naive. So that says something about his mindset and what he's seeking in a relationship. Marinucci and Jennifer have actually known each other before. They've known each other for several years. And for whatever reason, Marinucci is really jealous as a character. She's known to be somebody who has quite an envious streak. She's also regarded as a very manipulative character, whereas we've got the opposite of this in Jennifer. Jennifer isn't manipulative, she's naive, she's innocent, she's sweet. So these are almost polarities in the way that they approach the world. This is clearly really unhealthy as well, Because even though this is a love triangle, so to speak, involving Jennifer, Smyrnes and Marinucci, it's also out of balance as far as power is concerned, because in it, Jennifer is actually the most vulnerable. Doesn't matter that she's 30, she is the most vulnerable. Smyrnes has actually been in a relationship with both Jennifer and Marinucci for a few weeks. So he's playing them both. And there has been clashes in the past, it appears. So it's reported that both Jennifer and Marinucci had clashed over him in the past. He's probably really enjoying this. Remember, he's had a highly traumatized past. He's probably felt that he hadn't got a lot of power in his world. He also enjoys the idea that people want him because of the attachment and abandonment issues he's probably constructed and felt in his life. And to some degree, he's in a place where suddenly he's got two girls wanting him, which would be very alluring, wouldn't it? Unfortunately, what he forgets is he's playing with individuals' feelings. And where love and passion is concerned, that can boil over into something incredibly dangerous. We see this time and time again, don't we? In crimes of passion, that when somebody has strong feelings that involve sex, attraction, ownership over another person, territorial issues can come, and it can cause huge ramifications that are massively negative for the innocent victim, who might be the third person in that relationship, who is then set upon by the others because of that. Now, Marinucci also decided to throw in, when this is all going on, that Jennifer had previously stolen one of her boyfriends. So I guess what Marinucci is trying to do there is say that she and Jennifer have got some kind of beef. So this love triangle that's happening is really problematic. And what's even more disturbing is that Jennifer is obviously gone because she thinks she's meeting Smyrnes and she's got a relationship with him. But actually that isn't the case. It turns out she's been maliciously lured to Greensburg. In fact, it's Marinucci, Smyrnes' other girl, who's been texting her the whole time on Smyrnes' phone. And she's the person who's been inviting Jennifer to go and spend the weekend with him. As far as Jennifer is concerned, it's Smyrnes getting in contact, but actually it's Smyrnes' girlfriend. And she'd been texting her for 3 days on his phone. In later testimony, Smyrnes' cousin actually says that he did hear a conversation between Smyrnes and Jennifer literally a few days earlier, around February the 5th. And on that phone call, it was testified that Smyrnes was talking to Jennifer about love and marriage. Now think about that. You're dealing with a young girl with developmental delay. She's about 14 in her mindset. And you've got this guy promising her the possibility of love and marriage. She wants independence. This is probably like every single dream coming true for her in that moment. She's got this guy who loves her and wants her and is telling her that. So not only do we know that she's being lured there and doesn't realise that Smyrnes isn't the one texting her, she has some reason to turn up because he's been talking about this amazing commitment that he's going to give her. Sadly, that phone call was overheard by Marinucci, and she basically shouted when she heard that conversation, "I'm going to kill that bitch." I know that a lot of people don't take those things seriously, I get it. But in this case, this really does predict something pretty heinous. I will warn you now. Smyrnes actually heard Marinucci say that. It was noted by his cousin that he immediately recognised that it had been caught out. And that in itself means that Marinucci knows that Smyrnes actually likes Jennifer, right? So that's going to pour petrol onto the fire as far as Marinucci is concerned. She wants Smyrnes for herself. And that's going to increase and intensify any tension that she feels she has with Jennifer. And this seems to be the trigger where Marinucci thinks, I want revenge. As far as she's concerned, remember, it's already been the case that Jennifer's stolen one of her boyfriends before, and she's like, this is not going to happen again. Although, with respect, the guy that she's obsessed with is somebody that you really need to think about hiring a game. I mean, he's a criminal with sexual assault history. Hardly the kind of person you'd want to take home to your mother. But everyone's different. So Jennifer arrives at the bus station in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, and she meets up with Smyrnes. At the time, he turns up with a group of people. That's 27-year-old Peggy Miller. That's who she said to her mum and dad she's going to be staying with. and Peggy Miller's fiance, 36-year-old Robert Masters, and Marinucci is also present. The group were actually in the bus station waiting there because they were going to meet a friend, and that friend is 20-year-old Melvin Knight. Now, you'll be very surprised to realise that Smyrnes and Knight had actually met at a local charity where they were working. No, that's absolute lies. They've met in prison. They met in prison. So great that he's spending his time with convicted felons. Knight also brought his pregnant girlfriend with him, 20-year-old Amber Meidinger. And Knight and Meidinger had met when they were living in a homeless shelter in January 2010. So we're talking about a group of individuals who've all had pretty troubled pasts, haven't we? It's not been easy for any of them, and I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that people who have had horrible pasts cannot become incredible human beings. I'm just saying that this group of individuals seem to have had their fair share of problems and probably aren't the most well-adjusted people to hang around with in a gang, because obviously there are lots of problem behaviours that exist in this group. It's also worth noting that Knight themselves had a really troubled past. He'd had a drug-addicted father, so he was in prison basically during Knight's early childhood. Also, Knight fell from a moving vehicle when he was 5 and had a really serious head injury, and that caused lifelong social and learning problems. You will know from cases like Fred West and other serial killers that head injuries can cause impulse control issues, and certainly when you see a transition between behaviour pre and post a head injury, it does give us some insight into the brain damage that's occurred. So Knight and Meidinger arrive and join the group, and that's actually the first time that Meidinger has met them. So she's not necessarily been around those people before, but she recognises Jennifer, because it turns out that both of them have attended West Place, and that was a facility that provided services to people with mental disabilities. So again, insight into the fact that there were quite a lot of vulnerabilities in this group. Now, instantly, Jennifer sees Meidinger and thinks, well, I know this person. I can trust this person. I've got history with them. And she kind of warms towards her instantly and begins chatting to her. And it's during this conversation that Jennifer actually brings up the fact that she was going to marry Smyrnes. So she's now told Meidinger that she's in a relationship with him, and that this relationship is one that's going to be hopefully a long-term permanent situation. Marinucci sadly overhears this, and she is not happy. You know, this is a guy that she feels she wants, and no one's going to take her man from her. So Jennifer is now a real problem because she sees her as a real threat. And she's heard, remember, Smyrnes having a conversation only days ago saying that he loves Jennifer and he wants to spend his life with her. Meidinger also says, on reflection, that she could sense the tension at that point between both those women. There was lots of jealousy. Obviously, the two women who were involved in this love triangle didn't really like each other. And at some point, it turns out that Jennifer goes and leaves the group, and she goes to the library. Marinucci and Smyrnes, strangely, at this point, then began holding hands. So Jennifer's just left. She thinks she's getting married to Smyrnes. Marinucci has clearly made a play for him and wants to be with him. And now Smyrnes and Marinucci are actually holding hands like they're a couple. So this is confusing, isn't it? So later on that day, Marinucci leaves with Knight and Maid and goes to the Knight Inn, which is a hotel that they're staying at. At the hotel, Marinucci tells Meidinger that she's in a relationship with Smyrnes. Now, bear in mind, we already know that Meidinger's been told by Jennifer that she's going to marry Smyrnes. So this is going to be confusing for everybody. And this is confirmed to some degree when Meidinger overhears Marinucci talking with Smyrnes on the phone. And she's saying, you better not be with that bitch. And that's obviously in reference to Jennifer. So it really does seem that Smyrnes is playing both parties in this situation. Later on that day, Knight and Meidinger meet up again with Smyrnes, and they go to this, it's like a dingy second floor apartment in Greensburg. That place was located on 428 North Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's at a time when Smyrnes is living with his cousin. But you know when you get those places where quite a lot of people hang out, and people just kind of stay periodically but aren't there all the time. You know, you just walk in and there's different people. It's one of those places. I don't want to say DOS house, but that's the way I feel I need to describe it. I've been in some DOS houses. I've stayed in some DOS houses. We all know what the DOS houses are like. They smell of damp and usually dogs. A lot of smoke as well. But when you're young, you just kind of think it's somewhere to chill. It's one of those places. It's a regular hangout for the group. Now at the flat, there's also Robert Masters and Peggy Miller who were there, and also a guy called Jason. I don't know his second name, I'm going to be honest. I tried to find out, I couldn't. I just know he's called Jason, so we're going to put him in there. Smyrnes invites Knight and his girlfriend to stay the night, and they happily accept. Obviously they're chilling together, they've arranged to meet, they're going to have some fun, so that seems to be that it's going to be quite a reasonable sized group at the apartment. And Jennifer then comes back from the library, and she's been there before, so this is a place that she knows, it's a place that she trusts, and it's a place that she's obviously had reasonable experiences at. At some point in the evening, we know that Jason leaves. It's good because I don't have a lot of information on Jason, but it seems like when he's left, this is when trouble begins. And it's not for the faint-hearted, what I'm going to talk about next, because truthfully, the torturous experience, the protracted nature of the horrific attack is something that is absolutely beyond disgraceful, beyond inhumane, beyond reason when you think about what Jennifer is actually guilty of, which is nothing at all. Nothing. But I'm just warning you. Like I said, it's even more challenging when it's somebody with learning difficulties because it makes them super vulnerable and you can't quite believe that anybody would want to harm them whatsoever. It seems that the trouble begins when Jennifer tries to be intimate with Smyrnes. Bear in mind, guys, this is always going to be told from other people's perspectives. The only people who are there are the people telling the story of what happened there. But this is the way they tell the story. Do I think that Jennifer was really desperately trying to get into Smyrnes? Probably not. She wasn't some kind of red-blooded female desperate for attention and lustful experience. We know that she was innocent and naive. She probably just wanted to have a cuddle. But nonetheless, this is the excuse that the perpetrators use for legitimizing what they do next, which is not ever going to be legitimate. We'll put that out there now. Smyrnes basically said, well, she came on to me and I rejected her. I wasn't interested. Well, a few days ago, you were saying you were going to marry her. So which one is it? But like I said, it's amazing how stories get told after events. So apparently, not only does he reject her advances, he reacts really angrily. Not sure why, but this is the way that the story plays out. This is the way that they report it happened. So he reacts angrily. Now, the following morning, we also know that Jennifer's meant to attend her doctor's appointment. However, after the evening spent with Smyrnes and these individuals, for whatever reason, she decides not to go. I don't get this bit, but apparently this triggered great anger in Smyrnes and Knight. Don't know why. Seems like a completely okay thing to decide not to do, to go to a doctor's appointment. But for whatever reason, the fact that she didn't leave was a problem. And Jennifer basically gets into an argument with them both about it. Later on, whilst Jennifer's taking a shower, Smyrnes phones Marinucci and decides to tell her about the apparent sexual advances by Jennifer the night before. Bear in mind, we already know how Marinucci is feeling. She's insecure. She's bitter about previous experiences where she feels that Jennifer's stolen her boyfriend. And now she's feeling threatened because Smyrnes has called her to let her know that Jennifer is into him that way, but is also painting himself as some kind of victim where he's rejected her advances and spurned her as a partner. Which, if that is true, why would Marinucci be bothered in the slightest? Sorry, but when I hear these stories and I listen to what they say in court and I read the information on them, my mind always goes in a commonsensical, very linear viewpoint. And the truth is, it would mean that Marinucci surely was thrilled. Why would she be angry? He's spurned Jennifer's advances. Surely that would put ease to her mind and not incite her to want to do horrible things to Jennifer. Marinucci is apparently furious and says, "Nobody is having sex with my man." And you're like, that's right, Marinucci, because Jennifer apparently didn't, because apparently he turned her down. So you see, the story doesn't make sense. Sorry, just saying. But this is how they play it out. So at this point, Marinucci is full of rage, and it feels like this is the point where it takes a sinister turn. So the group start really bullying Jennifer. And imagine what that's like. A group of people that you mostly don't really know, and they suddenly start turning on you. Initially, it's how can we embarrass her? So they do things that are really nasty. They take a purse, they start rifling through it. It's really invasive. It's a real violation of somebody's privacy. They take money off her, they take a gift card, they take a mobile phone, and then they get mouthwash and toothpaste and they put it into her clothes and into her purse. And whilst I appreciate this sounds like really pathetic, childish behaviour, put yourself in that situation where all of a sudden the room has turned and the way that you feel about the people that you thought you could trust has suddenly dissipated and you're really confused. And when they're taking things off you, you kind of don't know whether this is just them trying to have fun or whether there is something more of a darker undertone to it, but you don't really understand what's happening, why it's happening, how to stop it happening, and if it's going to stop at all. So Jennifer would be scared at this point. And that bullying carries on through the day. And I don't think that Jennifer felt like she could leave, because I don't think she would have felt that she was allowed to leave. Remember, she is very vulnerable. Then it starts to escalate. So initially they're trying to humiliate her by harming her clothes and harming her personal items, but then it starts with her getting hit. And they start hitting her around the head with an empty soda bowl. So obviously this is getting scary for her now. But then it seems like Knight really ups the ante. He starts getting really physically aggressive towards Jennifer. And the reason that he does this is because she starts resisting the fun that they're having with her. So she starts to defend herself, and rightly so. She's getting abused really badly. Yes, she's been humiliated, but when they've taken it to a physical level, this is terrifying for her. And of course she's going to want to resist. When she does that, this is when he starts to get very violent. He grabs her by the shirt, throws her up by a wall, and then he starts to choke her. And when he releases her finally, she just falls to the floor and she's crying. She's hysterical. This is somebody that she has no understanding as to why they've suddenly turned violent. Remember, whatever has gone on, Jennifer has not had an issue with anybody here. And suddenly she's being violently attacked this way. Then Marinucci arrives at the apartment. As we all know, she's pumped up apparently. She's going to come and get her man. And she's really angry because Smyrnes has told her about Jennifer's advances the previous night. I don't believe they happened, but okay, that's the story he's told. And she's decided by this point that she wants revenge. She wants revenge on this woman who had dared to proposition her man. So she comes in, confronts Jennifer, and Jennifer's clear that she hasn't got a clue what on earth is going on, that she hasn't done anything wrong. That does not go down well. The thing about group behaviour is when somebody decides on a narrative and a few start to follow, things get really dangerous. It's hard for individuals to stand up and say something is wrong when they're seeing it if a group of people are engaged in a certain behaviour. We see that constantly in gang and pack mentality. So in spite of the fact it's very clear that Jennifer's done nothing to deserve this, once permission is given by the other perpetrators to act in a certain way, it's harder for others to stand against it. So Marinucci, with Meidinger, then takes Jennifer into the bathroom to carry on this assault. This is two women, remember. One who's meant to be pregnant, and they've taken this innocent woman into the bathroom and they're carrying on this assault. And it's horrible. So Marinucci begins repeatedly pushing Jennifer into a metal towel rack. She causes injuries to Jennifer's head and chest. And Jennifer is just protesting her innocence. She's saying, I have absolutely no interest in Smyrnes, but Marinucci's having none of it. I believe Jennifer fully at this point. I don't think she has got any interest in Smyrnes. And I also think that she's very confused about this kind of retaliation for something she's not even engaged in. But Marinucci wants to have this narrative. She's been playing out this story, this fantasy, this belief system, using her own insecurities as ammunition and fuel to carry out this kind of behaviour. She doesn't want Jennifer to deny that she wants her man. She wants to feel that there is retribution deserved for this behaviour. So if Jennifer isn't interested, then Marinucci can't carry out this kind of attack, right? Because there would be nothing to attack. So she's denying the reality in spite of the fact that Jennifer is making it clear she doesn't want anything to do with this waste of space that Smyrnes is. And he is a waste of space. It's as simple as that. Yes, he had a horrible past. Doesn't give him an excuse at all. Should make him more empathic, if anything else. Just saying. So Marinucci then tells Meidinger that Jennifer also likes her boyfriend. That's Knight, remember. So that's what Marinucci has decided. That's the narrative, right? That Jennifer is some red-blooded whore who's going to steal all the men in their lives. It's absolute bull. But again, there's a permission base. That means that Marinucci and Meidinger have this connection now. They have this absolute synergy. You know, Jennifer wants their men. They're on the same side. It's powerful. Marinucci is highly manipulative doing that. She's clever. She wants somebody else to be involved in this. And by inflaming this idea that Jennifer wants to steal their men, she's got Meidinger in the palm of her hands. And instantly, she gets what she wants. Meidinger gets angry. She's very, very angry because, remember, she feels that she's in this relationship with this guy and she doesn't want that threatened. Jennifer's clearly at this point thinking, what the hell is happening? I've not shown any interest in this person. I don't even know your boyfriend. And she's protesting it. But every denial that Jennifer makes is met with violence. Because now the scene is set. Now Jennifer deserves punishment. Jennifer's repeatedly pushed constantly into that towel rack. She hits the head. She gets really violently damaged, essentially. And it seems that then Knight comes back in and he starts getting involved again. But then he drags Jennifer back into the living room. This is where you see the brutality of pack behaviour really, really begin. Because, you know, this has been humiliation, this has been embarrassment, this has been violence, this has been assault. All of these things have happened and it's awful. But now comes the dehumanising of this situation. So the group get oatmeal and spices and they dump it all over Jennifer's head and they pour water all over her. Jennifer's saying at this moment in time that her eyes are burning. Of course they are. She's got spices in her eyes. They then start shouting at her and telling her that she stinks. And then they force her to take another shower. So again, that complete manipulation and power play. They're getting her to do whatever they want. You know, she has to perform for them. They want ultimate control. Now, at some point, Robert Cathcart, who was the original tenant on the apartment lease, calls Smyrnes. He'd actually let Smyrnes and the other members of the group stay in the apartment as long as he did chores. And he actually says, I'm coming to collect some of the stuff that I need for my property. This is the moment where Jennifer could have been saved, isn't it? Because even though Smyrnes and Knight forced Jennifer into the attic, because obviously they don't want Cathcart to come and see, to some degree, there was a moment where he could potentially have discovered this was going on. So when Cathcart turns up to get his stuff, an altercation breaks out between him, Smyrnes and Knight, and that involves the police getting called. This is really sad. Because unfortunately, even though there had been this altercation, there wasn't enough cause for the police to enter Smyrnes' apartment. You just think about that. The police were there. Jennifer has been horribly assaulted in a sustained attack. She's been shoved in the attic. And if only the police had been able to get into that apartment, because that would have been an opportunity to save her, and that opportunity was missed. So Cathcart and the police leave, meaning that the group again have complete power over Jennifer. Smyrnes and Knight decide at that moment that they haven't gone far enough. They want to really humiliate Jennifer. They drag her from the attic and they force her to take her pajamas off. There is something so violating about making somebody remove their clothing. Obviously, we all know that human beings are born naked, but there is something so violating and exposing about being forcibly made to take your clothes off, and that's something that would have been really hard for Jennifer to deal with. At this point, they take those clothes and they throw them out of the window onto a porch roof, again letting her know that they are fully in control. Even worse, they then get a pair of shears and they cut off Jennifer's hair, right down to the scalp in places. Just think about that for a moment. Look, I appreciate that women have short hair. I appreciate that men have long hair. But truthfully, your hair is part of your identity, particularly as a woman, particularly in society where women's hair is revered as beautiful. In so many different cultures, it's revered as beautiful. It's an essential part of being feminine. And they cut it down to her scalp in places. They want to let her know that they're in control. But I also think part of this is to try to make her look less attractive. Remember, there are jealous women involved in this situation. Even worse, they then make her clean up the mess. And Jennifer's asking, why are you doing this to me? And you know what they said? To this poor woman who's been horrifically abused, they tell her that she's ugly and that no one's ever going to want her. That she's ugly and that no one is ever going to want her. Knight then grabs Jennifer, takes her into the front room, and it's at this point he stuffs a sock into her mouth and he brutally rapes her. Whilst Knight is raping Jennifer, his girlfriend, his apparently pregnant girlfriend, Meidinger, comes in and sees it, and she does absolutely nothing. But remember what her backstory is at this point. She believes that Jennifer is after her man. So is she seeing it as rape? Or is she seeing it that this woman has managed to take her man from her? You know, that's the story she's been told, isn't it? And it seems like the group are actually enjoying what's going on. Marinucci decides that she isn't going anywhere. She's going to stay the night at Smyrnes' apartment. She does, however, need to get some prescription medication from her place first. So Smyrnes and Knight leave and go to her parents' house to collect this medication. And they tell Miller and Masters, who are also there, that they need to keep an eye on Jennifer to ensure she doesn't leave. Remember now, Masters and Miller have been kind of brought into this now. They've been roped into it. So now they're essentially holding somebody against their will. But what does that tell you about the manipulation of the others? That they've managed to coerce two relatively innocent individuals at this moment in time into basically creating a scenario where they're involved in holding an individual against their will whilst she is being violently assaulted. I mean, now they're involved in a high-level case and they are culpable. It is worth noting that at some point, Robert Masters did seem to take pity on Jennifer. He went and got her clothes for her. But Miller, Peggy Miller, goes and contacts the others as they're leaving Marinucci's home to say that Jennifer's trying to escape. I bet she was. I bet she was trying to escape. I bet she was begging and pleading and trying to get away. And it seems that Miller didn't have the stomach potentially to create the same level of power and control over Jennifer as the others, and was probably becoming concerned because if the others returned and Jennifer got away, that she would probably be the person getting beaten up next. So Smyrnes and Knight run back to the apartment and they confront Jennifer over the fact that she wants to leave, and they beat her up again. This is the girl who spent the whole day being horribly abused. Then, unbelievably, they force her to take some of Marinucci's prescription medication. They tell her it's headache medication, but I'm sure that Jennifer was aware that something sinister was happening. Actually, it was Seroquel. And Seroquel is a really strong antipsychotic medication. It's used for the treatment of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. so tablets that Jennifer should not have been taking. They then left Jennifer alone in the front room and they all went to bed. You know, what was going on that they could even sleep? And also, what state was Jennifer in at that point to stay? It demonstrates ultimate control, doesn't it? That Jennifer stayed in that situation. And it also tells us that there is a likelihood that Jennifer really didn't know what was about to befall her. The next morning when they wake up, Marinucci, Smyrnes and Knight leave the property to go and cash a cheque. Again, tell Meidinger, Masters and Miller to just make sure that Jennifer doesn't leave the apartment. You know, she's obviously quite injured at this point. There are going to be questions asked. They don't want that to happen. And they make it clear, if you let her leave, bad things are going to happen to people who helped her. Now, I completely believe that those individuals thinking about the situation would likely have believed that the consequences would be pretty severe. You know, look at what's happened to Jennifer. So they do it again. They keep Jennifer there. And when the group arrive back and reconvene, instantly, Marinucci accuses Jennifer of drinking soda from the fridge. And even though Jennifer denies this completely, because bear in mind, she's just spent the last 24 hours being force-fed things, being made to drink whatever people are making her drink. And she says, I'm tired of drinking what people are making me drink. I don't want to. I haven't done this. They just don't care. Marinucci pushes Jennifer to the floor and climbs on top of her and begins punching her repeatedly in the face. Onlookers who saw that, so members of the group who saw that happen, said, look, Jennifer did try to defend herself. And at one point, she manages to knee Marinucci in the stomach, which rightfully so would occur. Imagine being in that scenario. You are going to have to want to fight like hell to protect yourself. And Jennifer does the right thing in trying to. So now Marinucci gets up after being obviously kneed in the stomach and goes and tells Smyrnes immediately that basically she was pregnant and Jennifer has killed her baby, which is news to all of us because none of us actually know that Marinucci is pregnant. Because guess what? She wasn't. She was never pregnant. She just decided to pluck it from the clouds, to just go and use it as ammunition to cause further destruction towards Jennifer. So of course, Smyrnes, who's already a violent, abusive control freak, comes back, confronts Jennifer, and basically says, why should you be allowed to live now I know you've killed my child? That actually happened. This leads to this really bizarre series of episodes where Smyrnes holds what he calls family meetings. So there's several of these family meetings. 1, you're not family. 2, you're not in some kind of mafia. 3, stop it. Marinucci basically demands at this point that Smyrnes chooses between her and Jennifer. The group, we know, who are now completely against Jennifer, all sit down to discuss this. What's the next course of action? And we all know what's going to happen because of the fact that Jennifer is already isolated. She's alienated from the group. She is somebody that they are using as a punch bag at this point. They're hardly going to be defending her in the group, are they? Jennifer's in a really bad way at this point. Just let's put it into context. She's been raped, repeatedly beaten and drugged. She's barely conscious. This weird meeting occurs, and after that, it's like they have vowed to do as much damage as possible to this innocent girl. They take the abuse to a completely next level, and it's all about how do we humiliate, how do we degrade Jennifer even further. Knight and Meidinger take her into the bathroom, and that's where Meidinger beats her around the head with a metal towel rail. Remember, she's barely conscious at this point. The group then decide, and this is just so dehumanizing, it's unbelievable. They decide that Jennifer needs to drink pregnant pee because it's stronger. So Marinucci then urinates into a cup and they force Jennifer to drink it. And she's gagging all the while. Of course she is. There is so much aversion to that kind of experience. The group are not satisfied with this, so they obviously don't feel that it's caused enough of a reaction from Jennifer as they require. So they make this horrific other concoction. It's containing urine, Meidinger's feces, and some random herbs and spices. Makes me feel like I'm going to throw up even saying that. Just think about the smell, the texture, the disgusting concoction that they're forcing this innocent person to drink. And she refuses it, of course she does. And at that moment, they just beat her around the head again, and until she complies, they continue that assault. So of course, in the end, she gives in. Just imagine that for a moment. They then make this other concoction, and that's got water, bleach, cigarette ends, and some of Meidinger's prescription medication. So just one after the other, this relentless, disgusting mixture being force-fed into the mouth of this already half-conscious, beaten woman. Then Meidinger starts again, beats Jennifer around the head, and makes sure that she basically drinks every last drop. And all the while, it's completely unsurprising that Jennifer is vomiting and crying, because this is now the stuff of absolute horror stories, isn't it? This is the stuff of absolute nightmares. If that's not enough, Smyrnes and Knight then drag Jennifer into the front room. And again, this desire to humiliate her so fully is something that feels that they're not achieving as they wish to achieve, and they have to go further and further and further. So they get Christmas lights out and they tie her feet up with a string of these Christmas lights. And Marinucci basically says, like, plug them in. I want to make Jennifer look like a Christmas tree. Again, dehumanizing. Just one step away from being able to consider her an object, isn't it? To make her something that they can play with. You know, she's no longer human. When they try to put the lights on, they fail. And Marinucci is absolutely incensed by this, because her vision to humiliate Jennifer, it just isn't going to plan now. So she's angry. She's built herself up into this rage anyway. She wanted to light her up like a Christmas tree, and that hasn't happened. So the group then remove the bulbs from the string of lights, but not because they want to stop this, simply because they want to use the wire to tie Jennifer's ankles and wrists together. They also, at this point, tie a garland around her feet, and they paint her face with Miller's nail varnish. You can just see, can't you, how step by step they're removing any relationship towards a human and replacing it with something that they can use for their own fun. They're not concerned about her emotions, they're not concerned about her life, they're not concerned about who she is as a human being. They want to strip her of all of those things. And then they start taking turns kicking her in the stomach, because in their mind they think she might be pregnant. There's a lot of, we think this person might be pregnant, I'm pregnant even though I'm not pregnant. You know, it seems to be a theme, and again, they're legitimizing their behavior by wanting to stop her having a pregnancy that we will assume they thought Smyrnes was responsible for. So again, cutting the ties of any potential relationship with him. But it's just an excuse, isn't it? They're just creating these stories and giving themselves excuses to act in this behavior. They look around for anything to beat her with. I mean, she's beaten with a vacuum cleaner, she's beaten with a crutch, and Jennifer at this point is just begging to go home. She wants to go home to her mum, to her dad, to her lovely family. For some reason, at the point where she's begging for her life and for her family, Smyrnes then holds another one of these bizarre family meetings, but this time the discussion is about whether they should let Jennifer live or die. Utterly freaky and bizarre. And you know what? Every single member of the group was given an opportunity to vote on this, whether Jennifer should be allowed to live or indeed be murdered. And every single member of the group vote that Jennifer should die. They're all in the same shared space. And also, they feel they have a right to make that kind of decision. And the reason they do it is quite simple. They don't want her to talk about what's happened. They know that they would be in trouble. And the consequential thinking is, well, if we murder her, that will be like a lot less trouble for us than if we just assault her. I mean, that in itself shows you how broken and fractured their thinking was, that they see that murder would be less of a problem than her maybe going and telling the police that she's been assaulted by them. Nonetheless, this is the decision that they come to, and Smyrnes then goes and asks Jennifer if she wants to die. Think about that. Obviously, Jennifer doesn't want to die. Obviously, she's going to say no. She's going to plead with them. She's done absolutely nothing wrong. But Smyrnes says, well, you did. You tried to kill my child, this fictional child that doesn't exist. But you again can see the way that he validates his beliefs and his actions, and he gives himself an excuse so he can carry out what he ultimately wishes to carry out, which is the murder of an innocent woman. Think about the abuse that Jennifer's been through. Imagine the fear, the panic, the terror. Imagine being drugged, force-fed, all these horrific substances, and then standing there knowing that this group of people that ultimately you thought were friends have turned on you and now want you dead. But if it's not bad enough that she would have been going through that in that moment, Smyrnes made her write a suicide note. He told Jennifer, we're going to kill you, and we're going to make your death look like a suicide so that we're not held accountable. This is what Jennifer went through in her last hours. It doesn't matter that we know that these individuals were caught. Jennifer had to write a suicide note, dying, likely believing that her family would believe that she had purposefully and willfully killed herself. Imagine the psychological torture of doing that. And even though this is not a group of sophisticated criminals, this is a group of criminals who do feel that there is a potential that they should and could get away with murder. And they force her to write that note. And in that note, she says she doesn't want to live anymore. It's at this point, after she's written that note and essentially to some degree signed her own death warrant, that Marinucci basically says, just kill that bitch. The group then drag Jennifer, who's basically still tied up at this moment in time, into the bathroom. They turn the lights off. They make her kneel down. Just think about what she's going through in this moment in time. Smyrnes then hands Knight an 8-inch knife from the kitchen and tells him, you know what to do. Now, Knight initially says that I can't do it. Smyrnes says, I can't do it either. But for whatever reason, in spite of that initial protest, Knight goes into the bathroom with a knife. He even stuffs something into Jennifer's mouth because he wants to keep her quiet. And he even asks her, are you ready to die? I don't even know where to begin with that. I don't even know where to begin with the psychology of an individual who can feel initial aversion and then bolster themselves and actually go in to essentially execute an innocent human being. Because he goes in and he repeatedly stabs her in the chest, in the side of her body, and her neck. And if that's not enough, he even slices her throat. And she's still alive. In fact, she was alive on the bathroom floor, gasping for air. And then Knight leaves the bathroom, meets the rest of the group and says, dang, this bitch ain't dead. Marinucci then reinforces the fact that he needs to go and kill her and says that she wants Jennifer out of the place. And Knight then hands the knife to Meidinger and then she hands it to Smyrnes. And he goes into the bathroom and he doesn't feel any empathy or sympathy for this poor, mortally injured woman gasping for air on the floor. No, instead, he just slits her wrists. And even more disturbing in this moment is that Marinucci is annoyed that in spite of all this, Jennifer hasn't died immediately. And again, she says, just kill that bitch. I can't believe she's not dead. And bizarrely, even at this moment in time where this poor woman is dying on the floor in front of Marinucci, as opposed to having any empathy or reality of what's happening, all she does is go on about the fact that she doesn't understand what Smyrnes saw in Jennifer. She even refers to her, in her words, as retarded, whilst she's literally taking her last breath, so to speak. After Smyrnes has cut Jennifer's wrists, he gets angry as well. He says, the bitch ain't dead yet. It's this point where Smyrnes and Knight decide that they have a plan and they know how they're going to finish her off. And they get the Christmas lights and they use the wire from the Christmas lights to choke Jennifer to death. She's 30 years old when that happens. She's been tortured for 3 days and murdered by people that she considered to be her friends. Horrific. Horrific that she wrote her own suicide note and would have believed probably as she was dying that that's what her parents would believe, even stealing that piece from her. The group then have this next bizarre family meeting to decide what they're going to do with the body. Masters says, well, we should put it on the train tracks. I've no idea why. I'm not sure why Masters thinks that putting her on the train tracks would dissuade authorities that a brutal, protracted, tortured murder had taken place. But I don't think any of these have scored highly on IQ tests likely since this happened. Just putting it out there. Do think that there were only a few brain cells there, most of whom were fighting each other in the moment. But anyway, Marinucci comes up with this idea of, well, no, we won't do that. We won't put it on the train tracks. We'll burn it in front of a church. Probably watched too many films. Nonetheless, bizarre suggestion. Imagine that was thrown out to the side in that moment. Meidinger says, well, what we should do is put it in the boot of a car. Gay Meidinger, you're probably not the kind of person that most career criminals would wish to have around, because that doesn't sound like the most effective plan. Just put it in the boot of a car. Smyrnes says what we should do is we should put it into a bin, wheel it somewhere so he wouldn't be caught. What's that? You put a body in a bin because that's how you're not going to be. I wonder why Jeffrey Dahmer didn't think of that. You know, Nielsen, why didn't he think of that? That was the answer to everybody's crime. Anybody who wants to get away with murder, just pop them in a wheelie bin, it'll be fine. Literally. Obviously not a lot of creative thought here. And this is really serious. I'm talking about an innocent victim, but I do clearly feel, personally, that this demonstrates the absolute core brutality, stupidity, and ridiculous ideas that these individuals had superiority-wise over what they had done versus what's going to be the repercussions of what they have done. Because they bizarrely have all this arrogance where they think they're going to get away with this. They genuinely don't think they're going to get caught. So of course, Smyrnes is like, well, obviously my idea. Who do that outside a church or put a body in a boot? Clearly the answer is to put them in a bin. So he goes off, gets a neighbour's bin, and then they take this poor woman, and remember, we've always got to remember, this is Jennifer, this woman who's naive and vulnerable and loved and loving and kind and liked by everyone. And they've done this horrific, horrific thing. And then they take her body, put her in a plastic bag, cram her head first into the bin, just without dignity, like trash, just putting this poor innocent woman out like trash. Smyrnes and Knight even use towels and bleach at this point to clean up the blood. So they're trying to think about the forensic and how to avoid getting caught. And at some point, just the pièce de résistance of this bizarre story is the fact that Marinucci actually brings in the fact that she realises now that Smyrnes loves her more because he killed Jennifer. He made Jennifer pay for what she'd done. Like a twisted Romeo and Juliet without the ending that we all desire. But that shows you, doesn't it, how twisted that mentality is. Because if you think about it in the context of reality, what Marinucci has just realised is that her apparent boyfriend is a murderous twat. I mean, she is as well. But it's hardly something you want in your Tinder profile, is it? Is willing to kill for you, literally. Because All it takes is for that person to have a bad day and you're the next person in the bin. Simple as that. If somebody has that potential, they are an individual who is highly dangerous and could kill you too. So not a good thing to have in your psyche as regards positive behaviour in a partner. Smyrnes and Knight then leave the apartment in the early hours and they take the dustbin, because they've got Jennifer's body there, to Greensburg Salem Middle School. And for some reason, and I have no idea why, they take the bin, they shove part of the bin beneath a truck, which is in a snow-covered school car park. So Smyrnes' idea of how to get away with a perfect murder is to take the body of said victim, leave it half under a truck, because the truck driver's not going to be like, what's this massive bin under my truck doing? Why is it heavy to move? Oh, hang on, there's a body in there. But this is the level of their thought out, sophisticated crime. So they then go back to Smyrnes' apartment and the group go to sleep. Because obviously they haven't just carried out the most catastrophic, horrific murder that has left a woman dead, and have kind of taken and transported a body, have cleaned up an apparent murder scene, and now they're just sleeping. Says a lot, doesn't it, about the mindset and psyche of these human beings, that they could go to sleep after doing that. Unsurprisingly, Jennifer's body is immediately found the next morning, about 6:30 a.m, by the driver of the truck. He sees this bin that's been stuffed under his work vehicle, tries to pull the bin out, the lid comes off, and he smells this really odd smell. Remember what bodies smell like? You know, there is often an iron metallic smell, and also she'd had so many horrible things put on her that there would have been a foul smell coming from there. And when the police arrive at the scene, it doesn't take them long to realise that the victim's Jennifer Daugherty. Jennifer's body from there, still in the bin, is sent to a forensic pathologist, and he notes that there's this really odd situation where there's Christmas lights still wrapped around her neck and wrists, there's a garland around her ankles, and when they do the autopsy, they establish that Jennifer's suffered like so many wounds, but multiple incisions, abrasions, contusions. Also, she had loads of prescription drugs in her system, which weren't hers. One of them was the antidepressant sertraline. She also had the antipsychotic. Some of the drug levels in her system were actually higher than the amount that were needed to cause death. The most severe injury of all was the stab wound that she'd received to her chest, and that had pierced her left lung and her heart. That had caused a really substantial hemorrhage. Basically, it was a combination of all those injuries that led to her death. And what's really hard for Jennifer's parents is knowing that she went through all of that. And even when they were inflicting those last blows, she was still conscious for a period of time. You know, she'd have bled out, particularly with that very big stab, for a couple of minutes. Yeah, after that, she would have lost consciousness, but she'd have been dead within 4 to 6 minutes of that blow. We know, however, it had been 3 days of torture. It's around this time that, in tandem to the discovery and recognition of who this body belonged to, that police start getting reports. And those reports are that there's a disturbance at an apartment where Smyrnes and other people live. And a neighbour says that during a period of time in the past few days, there'd been very unusual noises coming from the apartment, one of which sounded like a body slam, and also they'd heard screaming. It drives me mad, this. Sorry, is it just me? I do say this in my YouTube videos, guys. Please, if somebody hears something like body slams and screaming, just call emergency services. Call them, even if you're wrong, and it just turns out that somebody broke something and that somebody was laughing or screaming at a film. Just do it. It's better to be safe than sorry. Don't do what people do. It's the Kitty Genovese bystander effect, isn't it? Where people hear things, see things, even watch people being attacked and do nothing. It's like, do something, do anything. Don't do nothing, because people like Jennifer get to live if people react. And we have to do better, because this is a constant theme when we're talking about crime cases, and it's just not good enough. So the police start knocking on doors and asking questions. And later on in the morning that the body's been found, Marinucci gets a text of someone. And that text informs them that a body's been found at the school. Now, whilst we know what's happened to Jennifer at this moment in time, her family don't. So whilst police are starting to piece things together, at the same time, Jennifer's family are obviously concerned. Where is she? She's meant to have been at a doctor's appointment. And Jennifer's sister calls the apartment where Smyrnes is meant to be, but he's out at an appointment with his caseworker. So it turns out that Peggy Miller answers the phone. And Jennifer's sister's saying, do you know where Jennifer is? Of course, Peggy Miller declines and says, no, I don't know where she is. A little on from that phone call, Peggy Miller gets called by Smyrnes and he says, get out of my apartment because something's going on. He basically tells her that Marinucci and him have been picked up for police and have already been taken in for questioning. So imagine these guys are now aware that the police are onto them. And it takes a very short amount of time for the police to pick up Knight, Meidinger, Miller and Masters because they want to ask them these questions. They're already aware that they think they have the people who've killed Jennifer. You won't be surprised to know that during questioning, they were all deeply supportive of one another and stuck to the same story. No, that didn't happen. No, it didn't. It's one of our, guess what happens next? They all scream that it's the other people involved and implicate one another in the crimes against Jennifer, just like we expect these diligent criminals to do. So they basically just blame everyone. Initially, Marinucci wasn't even considered a suspect, by the way. This is how bizarre it is. So Marinucci was thought of somebody who might have known stuff about things that had happened, but wasn't actually involved in it. Little did the police realise, but they obviously had suspicions that there was some kind of involvement on a surface level. They didn't realise she was completely embedded in it. They did think she'd witnessed the events at the apartment, but hadn't carried out and wasn't culpable for the death. The police then search the apartment and they start getting loads of incriminating evidence. They've got the murder weapon. They obviously can see that it's in a state of disarray. They can see that they badly tried to tidy up. And whilst Marinucci is being questioned, because obviously the police are building a very strong case, she admits that there have been problems between her and Jennifer over Smyrnes. But she also says that they kind of made it up. They hugged each other at the bus station and all of their problems had been laid to rest. But she says the rest of the group were really angry with Jennifer because of the way that she'd interfered with her relationship with Smyrnes. Really? That's not going to stand up very effectively, but okay, all your friends are really angry, more angry than you. That's never happened in the history of man, but okay. She basically says the rest of the group had tied Jennifer up with the Christmas garland, and Marinucci did admit to punching Jennifer, but said that was all. Although that kind of goes against what you said about making up at the bus station. I just love it when criminals start telling little bits of truth. I didn't do anything, I just punched her in the face. You know, immediately the police are like, that's definitely an admission of a tiny bit of guilt because you're trying to be seen to be telling the truth, but really we know. So that in itself all starts to pieces. The truth was, it doesn't really take that long to realise that Marinucci has been one of the main instigators and had been involved in orchestrating all the events that played out. And you won't be surprised to know that pretty soon after she's taken in for questioning, she faces charges of first and second degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Big charges. She pleads not guilty to all counts. Not guilty. Didn't do any of it. So of course we know what happens then. Case goes to trial. Now, in a twist, as far as I'm concerned, of conscience, Meidinger testifies against Marinucci and all her co-defendants. By this point, Meidinger had actually pleaded guilty to murder, going against the advice of her attorney. She actually asked to give evidence on behalf of the prosecution. So bear in mind, she says she's guilty. She goes against her own defence by taking responsibility. And then she stands there and says, I want to give evidence to put these other people away. And you might think that she was doing that to cut some kind of deal. She wasn't. There was no deal to cut. She had pled guilty to murder. She did this because of her conscience. She said, I feel like it was the right thing to do. So I'm going to give credit to her, not for what she did. It was reprehensible, horrific, and completely undeserved. But it seems like it triggered something over time in her and that conscience was sparked and she wants to see justice done. She doesn't get any special treatment for that testimony. She has nothing to gain. What happened in the end was, because of this, in spite of the fact she didn't get a plea deal, she was allowed to plead guilty to third-degree murder, kidnapping and conspiracy. And in doing that, she did avoid the death penalty, but she got a lot of time inside. 40 to 80 years, it's highly unlikely she's ever going to walk the streets again. So she didn't get off lightly. It wasn't as if she suddenly got a sentence which would mean that she could live her life freely outside. Chances are she'll die in prison. Meidinger's testimony was what every prosecution desire. It was absolute bang to rights, devastating evidence against Marinucci, who of course is saying that she only punched Jennifer once and was hugging her at the station. But if that wasn't enough, there was more evidence that came against her from the inmates at her prison. So one prisoner heard Marinucci, Meidinger and Miller talking about what they'd done to Jennifer, and she and various other prisoners also spoke to Marinucci while she was in custody, and she actually told them what she'd done to Jennifer, told them that she wanted her dead. She even praised Smyrnes to other people, saying what a good job he did cleaning up the murder scene. And on one occasion, one of the prisoners actually remarked that they were eating this stew, and they said that it looked like dog feces, and Marinucci basically said, that's okay. I feed feces to retards. Her words, not mine, clearly. Doesn't sound like somebody who's guilty. Doesn't sound like someone who didn't get involved in the horrible abuse of the death of that woman. Sounds like someone who is quite happy that she did it and is actually gloating about it. And there was another occasion that's reported where Marinucci jokes, does anybody need a drink? I give bleach to people to drink. You can see, can't you, as well, what kind of human being she is? Because I think there is like a code in prison, isn't it? Like, snitches get stitches. Pretty sure that's it. Snitches get stitches, right? You're not meant to snitch. So there must have been something about this woman's character that meant the other prisoners wanted to get her in further trouble. Maybe it was because they realised that she had attacked and murdered and been involved in the horrible torture of a woman who developmentally was 14. I imagine that that might be a big reason why these women spoke out about her. So no matter what Marinucci was trying to do, she failed in her attempt to underplay a part in Jennifer's death, and she is found guilty on all counts. Now, before the sentencing, the court did look at her background, and guess what they found out? They found out that she had quite a nice background. She had a middle-class upbringing. She had a stable family. She did say she was raped when she was 13, which, if true, is horrific, traumatising. We would understand that that would change somebody's personality to some degree. It doesn't usually make you into a horrible murderer, but nonetheless, we will give her the fact that she says that. Also, she brings in the fact that she'd been raped by Smyrnes around the time of Jennifer's murder. Not sure I believe that. Not when we know about how desperate she was to keep her man. But she reckoned that the reason that she didn't speak out at that time was because she was scared of breaking off the relationship. Her behaviour doesn't really suggest it, does it? Sorry, I have to say that. Obviously, it's important to believe victims. I'm just saying she also said she was pregnant when she wasn't. I'm just saying that she lied to the police. I'm just saying there's a lot of lies involved in here, but this is what she said. I've got to say it because these are mitigating factors. Her mother testified at court that one of the things that did change Marinucci was at 15, she was hit by a truck and she suffered a really severe head injury. And they believe as a family that massively altered her behaviour, that she went on a real downward spiral. She suffered from mental health issues, including depression. She also started using marijuana and alcohol quite heavily. We have to acknowledge that being hit on the head in a severe way at a certain age, particularly when the brain is developing, is going to have potential problems, probably affect impulse control, and probably also have long-term issues regarding personality. We have to acknowledge that. And it appears as well that Marinucci used to claim that she had psychotic episodes, apparently saw hallucinations, saw her dead grandma, but an expert witness who was brought into court said that they didn't believe it. And I'm going to say this as well, Marinucci was caught asking a cellmate how to fake being crazy. I don't know whether I'd have been chuffed if that had been somebody asking me. Like, why are you choosing me to ask? What is it about me? Why me? But that's what she was doing. So is it more a manipulative attempt to appear mentally ill? I mean, she was a massively manipulative person, wasn't she? So just think about it for a minute. Why was this woman manipulative? Okay, she planned Jennifer's death over the course of several days. She texted on Smyrnes' phone to lure her in. She took part in Jennifer's humiliation and torture over 3 days. She encouraged other people to get involved in that. She repeatedly encouraged her co-defendants to kill Jennifer. I think we can all agree she's very manipulative. She's very callous. She's very aware of the power that she has. And it's unsurprising that the judge described her callousness as incomprehensible. She got sentenced to life without possibility of parole, and rightfully so. She did avoid the death penalty, and the reason for that is she was 17 at the time of her offence, and that means that in the eyes of the law, she's considered a juvenile. However, in 2012, there was a case heard known as Miller v. Alabama, and that established that it was unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to life without parole, without first considering any mitigating factors. So Marinucci, of course, she's manipulative, she likes to play the system and get away with things. She appeals her sentence, and she says, look, there's been an error of law in my case, which to some degree she has a right to do. But again, I always go, does that mean that you took seriously what you did? If what you want to do is just get out? Because that's basically what they're trying to do, isn't it? To find a kind of error in the way that they were sentenced and have that sentence revoked. So her case gets reconsidered. In 2015, they look at it and they decide to let her out. No, they don't. They impose a life sentence without parole as before. They're like, no, that was the right decision. You definitely deserve to be in prison for life. Marinucci has never shown any remorse. Never admitted a part in Jennifer's death. Never. Meidinger was amazing, really, wasn't she? Just making sure that those individuals went down correctly and that Jennifer's justice was at least served. Also, I want it to be noted that Marinucci loves telling her inmates what she did to Jennifer, because that's the way of instilling fear. And she gets to bully them that way, and she's known to do that. So she hasn't done any changing. She's going to spend the rest of her life being a problem. It's likely that she's going to be one of those individuals that fails to change. Smyrnes also found guilty on all counts. 28th of February 2013, he was sentenced to death. The court also considered his background. Of course they did. They have to look at those mitigating circumstances. You know, he had alleged sexual abuse as a child, history of really severe mental illness. They're important issues to look at. However, when they looked at what he'd done, the serious aggravating factors were huge. You know, we've got the vulnerability of a victim. She had the mental age and capacity of a 14-year-old. The murder was also committed when she was kidnapped, so he'd kidnapped her. The murder itself included long drawn-out periods of protracted torture. And then on top of that, you know, he tried to conceal the body. He had a massively significant criminal record, and the judge felt that the death penalty was justified. He did try to appeal that sentence in 2017, but it was unsuccessful, and he is on death row, but currently his execution has been delayed. Knight's actions, they were also identified as a major factor in Jennifer's abuse and death. He, again, faced the same charges: first degree and second degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. And the strength of the evidence against him was massive. So massive that pretty much earliest opportunity, he just pled guilty. The court, again, they considered the mitigating factors. So he had no significant history of previous convictions. He was only 20 at the time of the offence, and he also pled guilty really early on. The aggravating factors, however, far outweighed the mitigating factors. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to look at the mitigation factors. Why can we give this person a certain license for their behaviour versus the aggravating? When we look at this and what their behaviour showed, was this something that can be balanced when you think about the life they've had before? And it's a no. The aggravated factors were huge here. So again, at a penalty hearing, the jury sentenced him to death on the 30th of August 2012. Again, he appealed his sentence in 2020. It was unsuccessful. He's on death row awaiting execution. Peggy Miller, She pleaded guilty and she was sentenced to 35 to 74 years for her part in the crimes. Rightfully so, she was heavily involved and she could have let Jennifer go. Robert Masters, he pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He got 30 to 70 years. Now, even though you may think, well, Miller and Master didn't really abuse Jennifer, well, they did. They took part in family meetings and they voted for her death. They also failed to alert the police about the abuse, and the reality is that if they had, Jennifer would be alive. And it's as a result of Jennifer's death that Jennifer's law was proposed. And Jennifer's law says that it would be a criminal offence to witness a violent crime and not to report it, which is absolutely so profound and so important. You are complicit. If you are witnessing a crime and you can do something about it and you know what's happening and you do nothing, then you are absolutely complicit and you deserve to serve a sentence. I think we can clearly see that what this case demonstrates is just the gang and group and pack mentality and the willingness to give permission to act out in ways that are reprehensible simply because there are other individuals acting that way. And we see this time and time again in crime. This group took complete advantage of a very vulnerable woman. The way that they treated her was like she wasn't human. They dehumanized her so they could do that. You know, like I said, they threw out her body like rubbish. You know, this case bears witness to the absolute brutality that some individuals have within their nature, and also reminds us that people's capacity is something that often we are unaware of until they are placed in scenarios like this. Any one of those people could have left and called the police. Any one of those people could have protested and been there to try to help Jennifer, and none of them did. And okay, we can all accept that Smyrnes and Marinucci were really powerful characters and they're individuals who could impose a certain amount of wrath over an individual, but they weren't powerful enough to control all those humans. They all took turns in some way or another to harm that innocent person. And it's devastating to imagine that Jennifer's last moments were spent in that situation, being treated like trash after writing her own suicide note, feeling that her parents were potentially going to believe that that is how things played out. That is something that is hard to even conceptualize as a human being. To have the ability within you to catastrophically impact a family like Jennifer's, to rob any peace in those moments of death by making Jennifer feel like she was even fraudulently writing her own suicide note, and essentially to dump her body like trash under a lorry. This was a kind, loving, loved, compassionate woman. A woman who wanted independence, who wanted friends, who wanted love, who wanted a future. And more than anything, was entitled to that future, and a future that would have been good, because Jennifer was somebody who was cared for, and was somebody who was supported, and was somebody, to all intents and purposes, that would have carried on living a good, kind, compassionate life, surrounded by good, kind, compassionate people. The only good part of this story is the fact that the perpetrators are probably never going to see the light of day. And like I said, at the end of the day, every single one of them deserves exactly what they got. Simple as. I hope you guys have found this intriguing, interesting, devastating. I hope that you all think about Jennifer and think about a life that was stolen and a family who had a person stolen from them. And I hope I've done it justice. It's really tough talking about an individual who's incredibly vulnerable and finds themselves brutalized in that manner because they don't have the opportunity to defend themselves appropriately. It's just not a level playing field. And life isn't. That's the sad thing. And often people that we believe that we can trust aren't trustworthy at all. And in this case, that's why Jennifer ended up in that situation and discarded like trash, something that she absolutely was worth so much more than. Thanks for joining me, and if you do like my content, then why don't you subscribe immediately? Immediately, just subscribe. You'll never miss me anytime. I'm consistent. Every single Wednesday and Sunday, I'll be here. Also, join me for a live chat. My live chat's great. My community is great. Kenny's crime cult is growing. There will not be any poison in the Kool-Aid though. I'm just saying. there won't probably be any Kool-Aid. It's virtual. But if it wasn't virtual, there'd be no murder involved, apart from the ones I talk about. See you next time. Take care.